June 1943. Midnight settles over the Asopos Gorge like a shroud, swallowing the last traces of daylight beneath the cliffs of central Greece. Far below, the river churns in a white, icy torrent, its roar rising up the canyon walls until it becomes a constant, living growl. Against this sound, a lone figure moves in the darkness. Captain Geoffrey Gordon-Creed of the British Special Operations Executive, pressed flat against a vertical sheet of rock slick with mist. The cold bites through his clothes. Metal tools knock faintly against his ribs. Above him, barely visible against the moonlit sky, stretches the black outline of the Asopos railway viaduct, a steel colossus the Germans insist cannot be touched. Its guard posts glow dimly, cigarette embers drifting like fireflies beside the rails. Every few seconds, a distant footstep or low voice slips through the wind, reminding him that one mistake means a bullet, and a fall that would vanish him into the river below. Gordon-Creed inches forward, hand over hand, until at last his fingers brush the chilled steel underbelly of the bridge. And to understand how one saboteur reached this impossible place, we must step back into the world that brought him here. In the summer of 1943, the war in Europe hung in a tense balance, its vast machinery grinding across continents with a momentum that seemed almost unstoppable. Germany still occupied most of the European mainland, but the tides were shifting. In North Africa, Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps had been driven back and defeated. To the north, the Eastern Front swallowed armies by the tens of thousands as the Wehrmacht strained to hold ground against Soviet forces pushing west with rising confidence. And far from these great fronts, in the limestone mountains and deep ravines of occupied Greece, a quieter but strategically vital struggle unfolded, one that would shape the Allied path into the heart of Hitler's empire. The Allies had decided that Italy would be the next target, specifically Sicily, but the success of that plan depended on deception. German intelligence had to be convinced that the blow would fall not on Sicily but in Greece, where fragmented resistance movements and harsh terrain already tied down substantial occupation forces. Sabotage, misinformation, and covert operations became tools as essential as tanks or bombers, and Britain's Special Operations Executive, SOE, was tasked with turning the mountains of Greece into a battlefield of shadows. Greece in 1943 was a place stretched thin by occupation. German, Italian, and Bulgarian forces carved the country into zones of control, draining its resources to feed the wider war effort. Railways, especially the north-south line connecting Salonika to Athens, became the lifeblood of German logistics in the Balkans. Along this line stood a handful of monumental bridges built before the war, engineering marvels suspended across ravines so deep they looked carved by centuries of tectonic force. For the occupying forces, these structures were indispensable. The bridges carried troop transports to the Aegean Islands, moved ammunition southward, and served as the arteries that kept Army Group E supplied across rugged terrain. Among them, the Asopos viaduct towered as the most daunting, a towering steel span set against near-vertical cliffs, inaccessible from almost every angle, a place nature itself seemed to defend. German engineers trusted it implicitly, believing the combination of height, terrain, and guard posts made it effectively immune to attack. But the Allies understood that breaking a single rail link could ripple outward into weeks of disruption. They had seen this before. In November 1942, SOE-led forces and Greek partisans had destroyed the Gorgopotamos bridge to the west, severing the line and halting German traffic for a crucial period. That operation proved the power of a well-timed strike and confirmed the willingness of Greek resistance fighters to cooperate, at least temporarily, under British command. Yet the victory at Gorgopotamos also brought complications. Political fractures among resistance groups widened, German reprisals grew harsher, and cooperation became less predictable. By mid-1943, the SOE mission in Greece walked a tightrope, balancing the need for decisive sabotage with the fragile alliances that made such missions possible. Into this increasingly unstable landscape came a new directive from Middle East Command. As part of Operation Animals, the deception campaign intended to distract German attention from Sicily, the Asopos viaduct was designated a priority target. The reasoning was clear. Destroying this bridge would paralyze rail transport between northern and southern Greece for weeks, forcing German commanders to reroute supplies through longer, slower, and more vulnerable paths. It would also add weight to the illusion that the Allies planned an invasion of the Greek mainland, prompting Hitler to divert reinforcements at the very moment Allied troops prepared to land across the Mediterranean. 4 SOE officers on the ground, the order was as daunting as it was vital. The Asopos Bridge was unlike any target they had faced since arriving in Greece. The gorge beneath it plunged hundreds of feet into a roaring river. The walls were so steep that local shepherds claimed goats refused to climb them. German guards patrolled both ends of the viaduct day and night, searchlights sweeping the ridges while engineers strengthened the structure against possible sabotage. The sense of impregnability became part of its myth. Every German checkpoint, every posted notice, every sentry's whispered confidence seemed to echo the same message: no one can reach this bridge from below. And in an occupied land where resistance fighters faced daily starvation and reprisals, even daring to discuss such an objective seemed half-mad. Yet in Cairo and London, where maps replaced mountains and distances were drawn in pencil, the operation appeared clear. The Asopos viaduct must be destroyed, and the task would fall to a handful of saboteurs willing to attempt what no conventional force could hope to achieve. It was a cold, precise line in an intelligence report, an instruction buried among many, but for the men chosen to carry it out, it marked the beginning of a mission that would test every limit of endurance, coordination, and courage, and before their climb into the gorge could begin, the SOE in Greece had to build the team that would attempt the impossible. The responsibility for turning the Asopos order into reality fell to the SOE mission already embedded within the mountains of central Greece, a small, overworked network of officers navigating the complex web of resistance politics and German countermeasures. At its head was Brigadier Eddie Myers, a seasoned Royal Engineer whose authority extended not only over sabotage planning but also over delicate negotiations with the major Greek partisan groups. Myers understood the stakes immediately. Blowing up the Asopos viaduct would demand far more than explosives. It required a team capable of climbing into a gorge considered nearly inaccessible, operating under the noses of German guards, and withdrawing unseen into a landscape crawling with patrols. When he reviewed the available personnel, one name stood out: Captain Geoffrey Gordon-Creed, a resourceful and unflinching SOE officer whose earlier operations had earned him a reputation for calm audacity. Alongside him were men like Don Stott of New Zealand, experienced, capable, and accustomed to the harsh unpredictability of mountain warfare. Together, they formed the nucleus of a mission few believed could succeed. Yet assembling the team was only the beginning. The terrain itself posed challenges no training ground could replicate. The Asopos Gorge was a place of stark violence carved into the earth, a vertical wound of stone and water. The river that thundered through its base created a permanent mist that coated every rock surface with slick, treacherous moisture. At several points, waterfalls crashed down from tributary streams, turning the narrow ledges into slippery, almost impassable hazards. From above, the German guards saw only a natural fortress defending their steel viaduct. From below, the SOE saboteurs saw a gauntlet of obstacles that demanded creativity as much as courage. Initial reconnaissance confirmed what locals had long said: there was no conventional path to the underside of the bridge. Whoever climbed into the gorge would be doing so on hands and knees, clinging to whatever cracks and outcroppings nature had grudgingly provided. The first attempt to enter the gorge was nearly disastrous. Ill-equipped and unfamiliar with the sheer violence of the river, the men found themselves battered by cold water, fighting to stay upright as the current and spray drained their strength. Ropes slipped, footholds vanished, and the noise of the river drowned out shouted commands. Exhaustion set in quickly. After hours of effort, they were forced to retreat, soaked, shivering, and acutely aware that failure in the final attempt would not end with a safe withdrawal. It would end with bodies lost to the river or captured by German patrols who would show no mercy. The psychological weight of this reality hung over the camp in the days that followed. Even among hardened operatives, doubt began to whisper. But while the team rested and reconsidered its approach, events across Greece were accelerating. Operation Animals had begun, unleashing a coordinated wave of sabotage designed to overwhelm German defenses. Bridges were attacked, communication lines cut, and railway tunnels targeted by partisans and SOE teams. The German response was swift and brutal. Villages suspected of aiding resistance fighters were burned, civilians were executed, and entire regions were placed under heightened surveillance. The country became a pressure chamber of fear and retaliation. For the Asopos team, this growing volatility meant shrinking freedom of movement. Patrols multiplied. Locals risked their lives to guide or shelter the saboteurs. Every day the operation was delayed increased the likelihood that someone would betray or inadvertently reveal their presence. Still, intelligence and persistence gradually revealed possibilities. A second reconnaissance, carried out by Don Stott and 2 others, made a critical discovery. By following a narrow, almost invisible ledge beyond a waterfall, they reached a section of cliff where past German engineering crews, before guard duties intensified, had cut shallow steps into the rock for inspection access. These steps, long abandoned and partially eroded, led upward toward the underside of the viaduct. It was the first true ray of hope. The men tested each step, gauged the stability of the route, and constructed a makeshift bridge from a felled tree to span a particularly treacherous gap. Piece by piece, the shape of a workable approach emerged from the chaos of stone and water. When they returned to camp with this news, morale shifted. The gorge no longer seemed entirely invulnerable. It remained deadly, unforgiving, and indifferent, but it could be approached. And now, with a viable path identified and the enemy unaware of the weakness, the saboteurs could begin planning their final climb with renewed resolve. Their preparations took on a sharper focus, distributing equipment, rehearsing movement patterns, and refining the exact placement of explosive charges that would bring down one of the most important bridges in Greece. The moment was coming when all these threads, terrain, reconnaissance, strategy, and human will, would converge into a single night beneath the steel skeleton of the Asopos viaduct. For Captain Geoffrey Gordon-Creed, the mission to destroy the Asopos viaduct was not just another wartime assignment. It was a test of everything he had learned since joining the SOE. He was a man shaped by experience rather than theatrics, quiet, self-contained, and drawn to tasks others avoided. Those who served with him noted his ability to remain steady even in moments when the situation seemed to brush against the edge of impossibility. Yet beneath that composure existed a very human tension, the awareness that each climb, each approach, and each withdrawal in occupied Greece carried the weight of men who depended on him. In the weeks leading to the operation, he moved between Greek villages, mountain hideouts, and partisan camps with deliberate caution, knowing German patrols were tightening their grip. The strain of living behind enemy lines, sleeping in caves, rationing food, listening for the distant rumble of German trucks, pressed inward, but it never dulled his focus. This mission required more than courage. It demanded the acceptance that his margin for error was nearly non-existent. And yet, for Gordon-Creed, this clarity of purpose formed its own kind of resolve. The bridge had to fall, and he would be one of the men to bring it down. The Asopos operation was never the work of a single saboteur. It was the product of an unlikely coalition forged in the crucible of occupation: British operatives, New Zealanders hardened by earlier campaigns, and Greek partisans who knew every ridge, stream, and shepherd's path in the region. These groups did not always see eye to eye. The Greek resistance landscape was fractured, with rival organizations competing for resources and influence, held together at times only by the shared hostility toward the occupying forces. Yet when SOE officers arrived with the order to destroy the viaduct, personal rivalries were temporarily eclipsed by the prospect of striking a decisive blow. The Greek guides who led Gordon-Creed's team to the canyon edge took enormous risks. Many had seen their villages burned for lesser acts of defiance. Others had lost family members to German reprisals. And still they returned, night after night, to help carve a path toward the seemingly unreachable steel span. On the heights above the gorge, partisan lookouts watched for patrols and signaled safe windows of movement. Without their knowledge of the terrain and their willingness to stand with the saboteurs, the operation would have died long before the charges were set. It was a fragile alliance, but in those critical days, it held. From a purely tactical perspective, the Asopos Gorge was a nightmare. Every feature favored the defender. The viaduct stretched across a chasm so deep that even daylight seemed to struggle to reach the river below. The German sentries positioned at each end of the bridge possessed commanding fields of observation, and any large partisan assault would have been spotted and cut down long before reaching the structure. The natural acoustics further complicated matters. The echo of the river amplified footsteps, making stealth nearly impossible. For the SOE team, the key was to think not like soldiers but like climbers and engineers. The gorge had to be treated as a three-dimensional puzzle. Its ledges became routes, its waterfalls, obstacles to be bypassed, its slick stone walls, surfaces that demanded slow, deliberate movement. The abandoned inspection steps found on the second reconnaissance shifted the equation entirely. They offered a hidden artery toward the underside of the viaduct, unseen from the guard posts and nearly undetectable in the darkness. But reaching them required faith in their stability and physical stamina to endure the punishing climb. Every meter gained brought new hazards: loose rocks, sudden drops, and the constant threat that a single misstep would send a man crashing into the torrent below. And yet the very difficulties that made the gorge forbidding also made it the perfect blind spot. By embracing its dangers, the saboteurs turned the terrain from an enemy into the only shield capable of hiding them from German eyes. As these human, collaborative, and tactical dimensions intertwined, the foundation was set for the deeper layers of technology, deception, and enemy perspective that shaped the mission's final approach. Destroying a bridge like the Asopos viaduct required more than brute force. It demanded an intimate understanding of steel, tension, and structural vulnerability. The viaduct stood as a reinforced truss arch system, a lattice of interlocking beams designed to distribute weight evenly across the span. To bring it down, the saboteurs needed to target the precise joints where stresses converged, points that, if severed, would cause the entire structure to twist and collapse under its own weight. Gordon-Creed and his team carried with them carefully prepared charges of plastic explosive, chosen for their malleability and reliability in wet environments. Alongside them were time pencils, small, pencil-shaped detonators using chemical delays that, once crushed, triggered explosions minutes or hours later depending on the color-coded fuse. Their plan required not just placing explosives but securing them in an inverted position beneath the bridge, with freezing water dripping from the steel and the threat of discovery constant. Each charge had to survive the vibrations of passing trains, the moisture of the gorge, and the unseen movements of the structure. Redundancy became essential. Multiple firing chains were set, each designed to compensate should another fail. When the final explosive was pressed into place and the time pencils activated, the men were not merely withdrawing from a target, they were stepping away from a carefully engineered cascade that, if successful, would bring the viaduct crashing down in a single decisive moment. While the physical act of blowing the bridge was daring on its own, its true power lay in its role within a larger strategic illusion. Operation Animals, the broad sabotage campaign unfolding across Greece, was designed to mislead German intelligence into thinking the Allies intended to invade the Balkan Peninsula. This deception was part of an even grander scheme, Operation Barclay, which used fake orders, double agents, dummy formations, and manipulated radio traffic to inflate the number of Allied troops supposedly preparing for landings in Greece and Crete. In that mosaic of misinformation, the destruction of the Asopos viaduct served as a tangible, irrefutable indicator of hostile activity in the region. The Germans interpreted railway sabotage as preparation for an amphibious assault, believing the Allies sought to isolate garrisons and disrupt troop movements before an invasion. Every day the railway remained severed reinforced that narrative. Even before the charges were set, Allied planners understood that this bridge was more than infrastructure. It was a psychological pivot. The timing of the attack, just weeks before the Sicily landings, was deliberate. If German command concluded that Greece was the primary target, they would reposition divisions away from Italy, weakening the defense of Sicily and easing the Allies' first step onto the European mainland. Thus, the saboteurs in the gorge were not acting alone. They were one piece in a vast and intricate shadow war fought with false signals, staged reconnaissance, and the destruction of steel. From the perspective of the German occupation forces, The Asopos viaduct was both a logistical artery and a symbol of engineering confidence. German commanders believed it virtually immune to sabotage. They had reinforced the guard details, increased patrol frequency, and ensured that the steep walls of the gorge remained a natural barrier to attack. Reports of earlier bridge demolitions, such as the destruction at Gorgopotamos, had heightened vigilance, but the Asopos structure, with its sheer surroundings and difficult access, inspired a sense of complacency. Engineers assured officers that the underside of the viaduct was unreachable without specialized equipment, and no conventional assault could hope to approach undetected. When sabotage incidents increased across Greece during Operation Animals, the Germans braced for attacks on tunnels, smaller bridges, and depots but still considered Asopos secure. The security measures they relied upon, a handful of sentries, sporadic nighttime checks, and the towering canyon walls, were implemented under the assumption that the terrain itself remained their strongest ally. What they did not anticipate was that a small team, moving silently beneath their feet, could exploit the one oversight no soldier had considered, that the very inaccessibility of the gorge made it the perfect place to hide and approach. In the darkness, while guards lit cigarettes and paced their posts, the saboteurs worked unseen, altering the fate of an entire railway line. When the bridge finally fell, the shock rippled through German command. Their confidence, once anchored in the solidity of steel and stone, had been undone by a handful of men who understood that even the strongest structures contain vulnerabilities. All these angles, human, tactical, technical, strategic, and adversarial, collided on the night the saboteurs returned to the gorge to execute the mission that would define their legacy. The final approach into the gorge began under a moon so thin it gave barely enough light to distinguish rock from shadow. The team gathered in silence, each man checking his equipment by touch rather than sight, coils of rope, small hammerheads wrapped in cloth to dull sound, the packets of explosives that would decide the fate of the viaduct. Captain Gordon-Creed moved among them, his voice low, steady, and stripped of anything unnecessary. They all understood what this night represented. There would be no second attempt, no margin for improvisation. If the charges were not set correctly or if a German patrol stumbled onto them, the mission and their lives would end in the darkness. The wind funneled through the canyon in icy gusts, bringing with it the distant rumble of the river far below. With a final nod, the team began its descent toward the ledge that marked the top of the gorge. The world narrowed to the grip of their fingers, the tension of the ropes, and the careful placement of each step on stones still wet from cascading spray. As they moved deeper into the gorge, the roar of the Asopos River grew, a constant thunder that vibrated through the rock and into their bones. It masked their movements but also stole their ability to hear danger. The first obstacle came quickly, a waterfall throwing a curtain of icy water across the narrow path. The men crossed single file, bodies pressed flat against the cliff face, each step deliberate, as though the mountain itself were trying to push them into the torrent below. Gordon-Creed led the way, the cold numbing his arms and legs but sharpening his focus. He felt more than heard the presence of the others behind him, trusting the rope lines that linked them like an invisible lifeline in the dark. Beyond the waterfall lay the tree trunk they had positioned days earlier, an improvised bridge spanning a gap where the cliff had sheared away long before the war began. It wobbled under their weight, creaking faintly, but held. Once across, they reached the faint outline of the abandoned inspection steps carved into the stone decades earlier. These steps were their key. The saboteurs paused, catching their breath, allowing their eyes to adjust. Above them, the underside of the viaduct loomed, a labyrinth of steel girders silhouetted against the faint starlight. Every few minutes, the glow of a German sentry's cigarette flickered on the track bed overhead, a tiny ember seeming impossibly close. The climb up the steps was the most dangerous part. The rock was slick, eroded, and unreliable. A single loose foothold could send stones skittering downward, creating a sound that might echo up to the guards above. The men moved in near total silence, communicating with taps on the shoulder or brief gestures. At one point, a section of stone gave way under Gordon-Creed, dropping a small cascade of gravel into the darkness. The entire team froze. Far above, a guard paused mid-step. For a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly, they waited, breaths held, muscles locked, until the sentry resumed his patrol. Only then did they continue upward, inch by inch, until the cold metal of the viaduct finally met their hands. Reaching the underside of the bridge brought no relief. They were suspended over the void, clinging to a steel framework that had not been designed to bear the weight of men crawling along it. Gordon-Creed and the designated sapper moved first, securing themselves with rope slings before beginning the slow, painstaking work of placing the charges. The metal was coated with moisture, making every touch numbingly cold. They worked by feel, counting rivets and beams, locating the exact stress points where a precise amount of explosive force would shatter the structural balance of the viaduct. Each charge was pressed into place, molded to the metal, and fixed with bindings to prevent slippage. The silence was broken only by the faint tap of a tool. Each impact was cushioned by cloth and controlled with absolute care. Above them, the faint sound of boots on the track drifted through the steel. A German guard muttered something to another, the words carried through the girders as if from another world. The saboteurs froze again, bodies pressed against the cold structure, becoming shadows within shadows. Minutes dragged. When the voices receded, the work resumed. They set redundant lines, ensuring that even if one time pencil failed, another would trigger the blast. In the wet, unpredictable conditions of the gorge, redundancy meant survival. At last, after what felt like hours compressed into a single breathless moment, the final charge was secured. Gordon-Creed crushed the heads of the selected time pencils, activating the chemical reactions that would, after a carefully calculated delay, ignite the detonators. The soft crack of each pencil breaking was nearly lost in the noise of the river. He looked to the others, and in their eyes, he saw the same mix of exhaustion, tension, and fierce determination. Their work beneath the bridge was finished. Now came the final challenge, escaping the gorge before time ran out. The withdrawal began with the same careful silence that had marked their descent, but now every second carried a new weight. The time pencils were already counting down, their chemical reactions creeping toward detonation. Gordon-Creed led the way down from the steel framework, lowering himself onto the eroded inspection steps with deliberate precision. The cold had stiffened his fingers, and each movement demanded concentration to prevent a slip that could send him plunging into the darkness below. Behind him, the rest of the team followed in a silent procession, their ropes taut, their breathing controlled. The bridge above them seemed to pulse with unseen energy. The knowledge that it was now primed to tear itself apart infused every heartbeat with urgency. As they reached the lower ledge, the roar of the river swallowed the sound of their movements. The men gathered, adjusting their gear and preparing for the long, grueling climb back toward the rim of the gorge. Time was the enemy now. They could not move too quickly, or a misstep might end the mission prematurely, yet if they lingered, the explosion could overtake them while still trapped between the sheer walls. They began to climb, hands gripping cold stone, boots searching for holds worn smooth by centuries of water and wind. The darkness pressed tightly around them, offering concealment but no comfort. Above, a faint glow marked the presence of German guards patrolling the viaduct, their figures intermittent silhouettes against the sky. Minutes stretched into a tense, crawling ascent. At one point, a loose rock tumbled from under a climber's foot, bouncing off the ledge below and disappearing with no sound into the river's roar. Gordon-Creed flinched, imagining the tiny stone clattering its way through the steel beams where only moments earlier they had been suspended. He signaled for the group to halt. All movement stopped. They listened, straining to hear any reaction from above, but the sentries remained unaware. Slowly, carefully, the climb resumed. As the men neared the midpoint of their ascent, something far more unsettling occurred. Nothing. No flash. No tremor. No explosion. The delay had lengthened beyond what any of them had expected. A creeping doubt began to twist through their thoughts. Had the time pencils misfired? Had moisture compromised the charges? Had some unseen shift caused the explosives to detach? The consequences of failure loomed. If the bridge did not fall, the Germans would intensify their patrols, scour the gorge, and almost certainly discover the evidence of sabotage. And if they did, the team would be hunted relentlessly through the mountains. Still they climbed. Breath came in short, controlled bursts. Muscles trembled from exertion and cold. The top of the gorge seemed impossibly far, a line of darkness that never grew closer. Then, just as doubt threatened to overwhelm resolve, the world changed. A light tore across the canyon, brief, blinding, and silent. For an instant, the entire gorge seemed illuminated from within, as though lightning had erupted from the earth itself. Then came the sound. A deep, rolling concussion surged upward, swallowed and distorted by the river below. It was not a single explosion but a chain, a succession of detonations traveling through the steel bones of the viaduct. The shockwave struck the cliff face, vibrating through every handhold and foothold. Instinctively, the men clung to the rock, pressing themselves flat as fragments of sound echoed through the darkness. A second flash followed, brighter and longer. The viaduct groaned, an immense, metallic roar like a wounded animal. Then the structure gave way. Steel twisted and snapped. Rivets sheared off in showers of sparks. The central span folded inward, collapsing into the chasm in a shuddering cascade of metal. The sound reverberated again and again, ricocheting between the canyon walls as if the earth itself were announcing the bridge's demise. In the confusion above, shouts erupted. German guards ran back and forth along the remaining sections of the track, their lanterns swinging wildly in the darkness. From the cliffs below, the saboteurs watched the chaos unfold. They were still suspended on the rock face, witnesses to the culmination of weeks of planning and moments of razor-thin survival. But there was no time for reflection. The explosion would bring reinforcements within minutes. The team resumed climbing with renewed urgency, moving despite trembling limbs and the disorientation of the concussive blasts. The top of the gorge finally emerged as a jagged silhouette, and one by one, the men pulled themselves onto solid ground. From there, they made their way into the cover of the forested ridge. Dawn had not yet approached, but torches and floodlights already flickered below as German units scrambled to assess the damage. The viaduct lay shattered across the gorge, its severed beams hanging like the broken ribs of some fallen giant. The railway line, the vital artery connecting northern and southern Greece, had been cut clean through, and with the bridge now gone, the consequences of its destruction began spreading outward before the dust had even settled. The first hours after the explosion plunged the German occupation forces into a state of confusion. At dawn, as light crept over the mountains, the full scale of the destruction became unmistakable. The central span of the Asopos viaduct no longer existed. It lay twisted in the ravine like the carcass of a fallen machine, its steel beams bent and scattered across the boulders below. Smoke drifted upward in thin veils, mixing with the morning mist that clung to the gorge. Patrols combed the surrounding slopes, shouting orders, searching for clues, trying to understand how an attack had been carried out where they had believed none possible. Initially, German officers suspected structural failure. The gorge was known for violent winds and shifting rock, and the occupation command had long assumed that natural forces were the only thing capable of reaching the underside of the bridge. But this explanation dissolved quickly. When engineers descended to inspect the wreckage, they discovered signs that left no doubt: explosive residue, fragments of molded charges, and the unmistakable marks of deliberate sabotage. The discovery triggered a violent reaction. The guards responsible for the bridge were arrested and interrogated. Rumors spread that several were executed on suspicion of negligence before investigators uncovered the rope ladder and traces of the saboteurs' approach beneath the viaduct. That realization sent shockwaves through German command. The gorge, once regarded as a natural barrier, had been breached by Allied operatives who had used the very terrain the Germans trusted as their shield. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. If saboteurs could infiltrate Asopos, what else might they reach? Reconstruction began almost immediately, but the task proved as dangerous as it was urgent. A senior German engineer was brought in to direct the rebuilding efforts. Under constant pressure from higher command, he pushed work crews to operate at a punishing pace. The unstable terrain, weakened by the blast and the vibrations of falling steel, made every step hazardous. Within days, a new framework was rising across the chasm, but tragedy struck when a section of scaffolding collapsed without warning. The engineer and a number of workers plunged into the gorge, killed instantly. The incident deepened the sense of doom surrounding the project, as though the gorge itself resisted the restoration of the structure that had once dominated it. For the Germans, the consequences were immediate and costly. The railway line between northern and southern Greece, essential for moving troops, munitions, and supplies, was severed. Trains halted abruptly across both regions. Units scheduled for deployment southward were rerouted or delayed indefinitely. Vital shipments to coastal garrisons stalled. Communications officers struggled to reorganize transport logistics, sending frantic messages across the occupation network. What had once been a smooth and dependable artery of movement became a fragmented, uncertain patchwork of improvised routes. The disruption extended beyond logistics. The destruction of the viaduct fed directly into the fears and anxieties already simmering within German command as sabotage intensified across the country. Operation Animals had ignited a wave of resistance actions, from tunnel demolitions to railway ambushes, that made it increasingly difficult for the occupiers to distinguish isolated attacks from coordinated strategy. The fall of the Asopos Bridge seemed to confirm the worst-case scenario, that Allied forces were preparing for a major offensive in Greece. Even as German analysts debated the likelihood of an invasion, commanders redeployed units to guard vulnerable points and initiated harsh reprisals in nearby regions, attempting to regain control through intimidation. Yet even amid the panic, one truth became increasingly clear. The destruction of the Asopos viaduct had fundamentally altered the occupation's grip on the Greek railway system. The bridge had been more than steel. It had been a symbol of German confidence. Now it lay in ruins, and its absence sent ripples across the entire strategic landscape. Those ripples would continue to spread, shaping decisions far beyond the mountains of central Greece. The destruction of the Asopos viaduct did not simply inconvenience the German occupation. It forced a recalibration of their entire strategic posture in the region. As intelligence reports filtered in, German headquarters concluded that the attack was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of intensified sabotage sweeping across Greece. Rail lines were disrupted from Epirus to Thessaly, communication cables severed, tunnels struck, and depots targeted with increasing boldness. For commanders already grappling with the consequences of Operation Animals, the timing of the Asopos attack sharpened their suspicions. Sabotage on such a scale suggested preparation for large-scale Allied landings. Though the invasion of Sicily would soon reveal the true Allied intentions, the Germans could not ignore the possibility that Greece might still be a future objective. Reinforcements were held in the Balkans longer than planned, while internal security units were diverted from frontline support to guard against further resistance actions. The psychological weight of uncertainty, never knowing where the next blow would fall, became a weapon in itself. For the Greek population, however, the aftermath carried a darker cost. German reprisals intensified brutally across the countryside. Villages suspected of harboring partisans or assisting saboteurs faced collective punishment. Homes were burned, livestock seized, and civilians executed as deterrents. The cycle of resistance and retaliation deepened the suffering of communities already strained by famine and occupation. Though the saboteurs themselves escaped undetected into the remote mountain hideouts that shielded them, many Greeks paid the price for the symbolic and strategic victories of operations like Asopos. The German command's frustration at its inability to prevent such attacks often expressed itself in violence toward those who had no connection to the sabotage at all. For many survivors, the collapse of the bridge became inseparable from memories of loss and the brutal reality of occupation. Yet the operation also influenced the shifting political landscape within the resistance. Successes like Asopos elevated the prestige of groups aligned with British SOE missions, even as ideological divisions widened between rival movements. Cooperation, while achieved for specific operations, grew increasingly strained as each faction sought to position itself for the post-war balance of power. The prestige gained from the Asopos attack strengthened the influence of certain partisan leaders, but it also intensified mistrust among groups who feared British favoritism. The seeds of future conflict that would erupt into civil war after liberation, grew quietly in the shadow of wartime victories. On the Allied side, the saboteurs' achievements did not go unnoticed. Reports of the operation reached Cairo and London with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The destruction of the viaduct was recognized as one of the most daring feats of sabotage in the Mediterranean theater. Recommendations for awards followed. Stott and Geoffrey Gordon-Creed were later honored for their leadership and bravery, receiving the Distinguished Service Order, while other members of the team were awarded the Military Cross or Military Medal. Their actions entered the lore of the SOE, stories told in training camps, recounted in debriefings, and later preserved in memoirs of the men who had walked the thin line between survival and disaster. Yet for the saboteurs themselves, the mission remained rooted in the stark reality of war. A task completed, comrades protected, an objective achieved at immense human cost. By the time the railway was finally restored, weeks had passed, weeks in which German mobility had been stifled, reinforcements delayed, and strategic uncertainty amplified. The broken span of the viaduct, once a symbol of German control, became instead a reminder of vulnerability. Its absence, its collapse, and its long shadow over the occupied land remained etched into the memory of all who witnessed the aftermath. And in that lingering memory, the story of Asopos narrowed once more to a single image, a lone saboteur reaching for cold steel in the darkness, altering the course of events far beyond the bounds of the gorge. In the quiet years that followed the war, the Asopos Gorge returned to its natural rhythm. The river continued its relentless passage through the chasm, the cliffs weathered under sun and rain, and a new railway bridge eventually rose where the old one had fallen. To a passing traveler, little hints at the night when a handful of men suspended between rock and darkness altered the shape of a continent's war. Yet the significance of that moment endures. The destruction of the viaduct was not simply an act of engineering or audacity, it was a demonstration of how, in the vast machinery of global conflict, small groups of individuals can influence events far beyond their number. The saboteurs who crept beneath the steel ribs of the bridge acted within the narrowest margin of possibility, relying on resolve, skill, and the willingness to embrace the near impossible. Their victory was measured not only in the collapse of a span of metal but in the strategic confusion it sowed, the delays it forced, and the message it carried, that even the most formidable structures of occupation could be breached. It is easy, in hindsight, to frame such operations as inevitable triumphs of courage over circumstance. But the truth is more fragile. Every handhold in the rock, every muted tap of a tool, every moment of stillness beneath the feet of armed sentries carried the weight of uncertainty. The gorge could have claimed them. A guard could have glanced down at the wrong instant. A time pencil could have failed. Yet the mission succeeded because those involved accepted the risks without illusion. They understood that history often turns not on sweeping offensives but on moments of precision and daring, executed in places where most would never think to look. Today, the gorge remains, its walls silent about the night the indestructible bridge fell. But the echo of that moment still lingers, in military history, in the memories of the communities who lived through the occupation, and in the enduring reminder that human will, when sharpened by necessity, can reach even the places thought to be beyond human reach.